Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Y-Pod, where we highlight everyday Wyoming leaders. Very excited today to talk with someone I've really enjoyed getting to know, Sam Lightner Jr. Sam, thank you for doing this today.
Well, thank you for having me here. This is going to be fun.
And with Sam, there are a lot of things I'm excited about talking about. I'm sure there will be things that those of you who are watching live are interested in too. If you have questions for Sam, go ahead and put them into either the Q&A function or the chat function, and I'll field those, and then I'll give them to Sam so he can just focus on telling us really cool stories. Before we dive into either your new book, which we definitely want to talk about, or some of your favorite spots around Wyoming, it's always fascinating to hear how people ended up where they ended up. You are a climber, photographer, author. Were those things you always knew you wanted to do, or where did you pick up an interest in those things?
I started climbing. One of my best friends growing up, his dad was an excellent mountain guide. And so we were in the climbing scene as kids before we were actually climbers. And this is back in the late 70s, early 80s, when climbing is much more accessible now. Then it was more of a big mountain thing. Now there's a lot of what we call cragging or sport climbing that takes place on small cliffs. So as little kids, you really couldn't be a climber then, whereas now we have little kid climbing teams. But as we got older, his dad, Rod Newcomb, he lives over in Jackson. Rod taught Mark and I how to climb. And once I started to get sort of focused on it, and climbing taught me something that nothing else had ever taught me, which was the only things you're going to be proud of are the things you work really hard for. Once I realized that with climbing and started to feel proud of things I was doing, it's all I wanted to do. And I went to the University of Wyoming, but it might as well have been the University of Vitavue. I then started traveling all over the place, and I had friends who were traveling, climbing all the time, and just sort of living a dirtbag lifestyle. And climbing took me everywhere and continues to. I've lived in a number of places, but Wyoming's always been home. And Lander is it might be the best climbing town in America. Don't tell anybody. And I moved back here from Moab, Utah. I'd been down there for a couple years, 8 years ago or so.
Without starting any massive controversies in the climbing community, what are one or two reasons you might say that Lander is the best climbing community in the country?
Well, one, we all get along. You get three climbers, you usually get three different opinions, but we all get along here. But that community-wise, Lander is a community. It's a fairly tight. Everybody's friends. Cowboys hang out with climbers at the bar and so forth. So from a community standpoint, Lander's just nice that way. From a climbing standpoint, we have access to Sinks Canyon, to a dozen different cliffs in the various canyons that run into the Wind River Range from here, and it's easy access. And then we have just an hour out to the east of us, we've got the Granite Mountains, the Sweetwater Rocks area. So we have easy access to a lot of rock climbing. And then if you want to take multiple days, we have the Wind River Range, and that's right out the back door. So for those reasons, I think Lander's about the best climbing community in the country.
Well, we'll see how many vitriolic responses we get to top climbing city.
Yeah, you'll hear from the Salt Lakers. No, they're right out just because it's a city. Boulder, city, and the climbing's not good. Chattanooga, Tennessee is a very good climbing town. Doesn't have big mountains though. It only has the small stuff. It has very good small stuff. So there's a few of them that stand out, but I really believe Lander's about it.
That's a fantastic endorsement, and it's a great city, obviously, for anyone who's been there. We know that. The other aspect of the conversation today is a book that you had written, one of your many books. In your background, did you did you always know I wanted to be an author, or was it a big
I
commitment or to you to
no,
make?
no. I went on a trip with Mark Newcomb, who I mentioned earlier, that I started climbing with. He was in China studying studying something in China, and it was a soil related deal. And this is in like 1989, 1990. Uh, he said, you know, we've seen these pictures of these rocks in southern Thailand. We'd seen them in National Geographic, and then there was a brief thing written in rock and ice that a couple of German guys had gone there. And we said, well, let's go try and find this place. And it was going to be, in my mind, it was going to be kind of a nasty trip. It was going to be hot and sweaty and lots of mosquitoes, and we didn't know what we'd be eating. You know, it was going to be a jungle-y kind of a deal. Well, we eventually get to the point where we think, you know, we're gonna find the rocks, and we did find the rocks on a beach that has since been voted the most beautiful beach in the world, with lots of scantily clad European girls running around and people making Thai food and little bungalow operations to live in. And it was perfect. It was paradise. We didn't know that it was paradise. And when I left there, I got on the airplane. This is when you still had pen and paper. There's no such thing as a laptop. And I said, I got to write down what happened to me. And I started writing it down. And 30 hours later, I had something. I sent it into Rock and Ice magazine, and they said, we love this. Write something else. And that was the start of a writing career. I had never expected that was going to happen. And yeah, it took off. And I found that if I write books, I only have to deal with one editor, and that's just more pleasant than dealing with multiple editors. So yeah.
And there are people who have that rare ability to capture their personal expertise. You, I think, dipped into the talent bag a second time, because now with your newest book, this isn't an industry specific book. You shifted over into what I found to be a very engaging, very personable history book. And I've not been a big fan of history books other than biographies, because I like the story aspect of history. And it seems like you've really drawn that out in this book. Was that intentional on your part?
It was, and it wasn't. It's the way I write. The good reviews I've gotten in the past have said something about voice, that Sam's writing style, Lightner's writing style has voice. And apparently, that's not something you can kind of learn. I just naturally had it. And the way I think I naturally had it is, I am pretty bad as a technical writer. Like a newspaper would hate having me around because they'd have to edit everything, right? I write how I speak. And if you ever write down what you've just said over the last, say, 10 minutes, there's a lot of dangling modifiers and a lot of, incomplete sentences and lead-ons and run-ons and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's how I write. And then I go back to it and I edit it into something that an English teacher would accept. So I think because of that, my voice comes out, because I'm literally writing how I speak about it. And I think if everybody did history books that way, there'd probably be more voice in history books. But instead, they can be kind of dull. And they could also just be the facts that people choose, maybe more about technical things, political things that happen, and not about the people. And books are about people. The books that we really like, they're about a little boy who's a wizard, or a man who grows up to be president, or something along these lines. Those are the stories we like to read. And so if you write it from the perspective of what's going on with the people involved, I think it's better than writing the perspective of laws that were passed and so forth.
Well, and it's a perfect intro into some of the highlights that really jumped out at me as I was going through the book, and hoped you might share a few stories along the way. For those folks who don't recognize this image, Who's in it, and what's a little bit of the story behind it?
This, I believe it's called John Coulter Meets the Crow. This was painted by John Clymer, famous painter who lived actually in Jackson, next door to me. And his family owns the rights to these paintings. They've got a museum in Oregon with a lot of his first work. But I believe it's called John Coulter Meets the Crow. And it's set near Cody or Billings, I believe near Billings in the painting. And Coulter was on the Corps of Discovery group, which we normally call the Lewis and Clark expedition, but they called themselves the Corps of Discovery. He was their lead guy who would go out and hunt, but would also figure out which tributaries of the river to go up, and would basically set the course during the day, which also meant he was the first one to meet the indigenous people. And he knew the sign language of the Plains and Rocky Mountain Indians, and he knew how to get along with them. He was a very tough guy, and he really relished in this job of being alone in front of the Corps of Discovery, literally being the first guy. And they went all the way to Oregon, spent the winter, came back, multi-year expedition. He met some guys coming up the Missouri just a few weeks before, they totally smell the barn of St. Louis. They're about to get back with all that they've discovered and to fill Jefferson in on what's going on. And they smell the barn, and they run into this other guy, and he says, yeah, I'm going back. Anybody want to come with me? And Coulter's been gone for 2 years. He says, I'll go. I don't want to be back there. And so he came back, and they built Fort Raymond near Billings. And from there, in the middle of the winter, through the middle of the winter, leaving in October, he became the first member of the white tribe, if you will, to go through Northwest Wyoming. And he did it, doing it in winter he had a 35-pound pack. That's all he carried with him. The idea that you would go through potentially enemy territory, completely new place, on snow, sub-zero temperatures, and with all that he had, it's just mind blowing. It's like one of the guys reaching the poles for the first time, and Coulter pulled it off, and probably he showed up back at the fort with the other trappers, and they were probably pretty shocked because they'd just gone through a hard winter with walls and a roof over their head, and he came in and said, yeah, I found really interesting areas and great place for beaver, and made good contact with the crow and so forth. So very interesting character.
And in this image, Sam, I think about modern controversies we've had where we have, say, a Discovery Channel show about someone who's surviving on their own in the wilderness, no support whatsoever. Mm-hmm. The camera people aren't involved. But there's always this feeling that they're close enough to rescue. If nothing else, they have camera people with them. In this image, it looks like he was truly all by himself.
Oh, he very easily could have disappeared and we never found his bones. In this scene right here, these guys could have decided, you know what? I don't like the look of him. I don't like the hair on his face. I don't like him being here, and killed him. And the dogs eat him, and that's the end of it. He had nobody backing him up, and to be that bold, to go out like that in the middle of the winter. An interesting thing I've thought about is, like, why would he have picked winter? And here's one possible reason. There's a number of them, but one of them could be these guys. Most of the native tribes, various tribes, were settled into a particular spot. They weren't moving around a lot, so he could probably protect. The other one's the bears. The grizzlies were a threat to the Corps of Discovery, to such a point that Coulter was at times the only one allowed to leave camp without another person to back him up, because Lewis and Clark were just, we're going to lose somebody if we don't. And amazingly, they had only one person die on that expedition. He died of appendicitis, which is astounding. A multi-year expedition into what was a wilderness with with different peoples who some liked him and some didn't like him, and they pulled that off. But he may have done this because, well, I won't have to deal with grizzlies. They'll all be napping while I'm out. But why he chose winter, I'm not quite sure.
I'm pretty sure a lot of us wonder about that when we have to just get in our vehicles and travel around Wyoming in the winter.
Yeah.
It's
yeah,
a great way
his
of
course
showing
took him. His course took him from north of Cody, outside Wyoming in southern Montana, Fort Rimmon, to Cody, over the Owl Creeks, up the Wind River, dropped him into Jackson Hole, probably out over Teton Pass, up through Idaho, through Pierre's Hole, and then out across Yellowstone and back to Cody and north. There's not a colder place in the continental United States, so pretty tough.
It's a fantastic example of how you bring people to life in the book. One of the other images in the book really popped out at me. Who is this crew?
This is the so-called Petticoat Rulers. This is the first all-female elected town council and mayor. I think it's Miss Crabtree there in the middle, I believe, was the mayor. It was in Jackson, and it wasn't actually the very first female town council. I believe there was a town council in Utah that had been, but this was the first one, and the mayor and the justices of peace was female. She's not in the picture. And it came right after suffrage had been passed. So it made national news. And the Pearl, who I believe is related to Alan Simpson and Pete Simpson and Millward Simpson. Pearl was the Millward was the sheriff, justice of the, she was sheriff, and there was another who was justice of peace. She was the sheriff, and she made national news by saying things like, they would say, well, how hard is it to be a woman and be, a peace officer? Oh, I shot 3 people my first day I was in office, and since then nobody bothers me. And I mean, the Eastern press just ran with it. They probably thought it was true. And, her main job was, keeping wildlife out of the town of Jackson, or keeping the cows out and stuff like that. She wasn't having to fight it out with Billy the Kid or anything much. So,
what a pretty remarkable situation.
Yeah, but it was remarkable in that to much of the country, just the idea of women being allowed to vote was completely new. And I'm sorry about the dogs barking in the background. One moment.
We were talking before we started to record about how during these times we're in kind of the new normal. 6 months ago, if we'd had a dog barking in the backyard, everyone would have been up in arms, and now I actually read an article the other day that said we're finding entertainment in seeing this is how Sam lives, this is how Eric lives, these are their genuine backgrounds, those kinds of things.
So that's true, I guess, isn't it? Yeah.
About what's so remarkable about this group, I think?
Oh, well, for the rest of the country, it was remarkable because they were just getting their heads wrapped around the idea that women are going to be allowed to vote. And in Wyoming, we weren't just voting, we were voting them in. What was the 1924 election, Nellie Ross was elected as the first female governor. So these were all very new things to much of the country. They weren't new to Wyoming, though, because we had women voting since we had become a territory in late 1860s. So, but the rest of the country was fascinated by it.
In interests of, I know you can dive deep on all of these stories, Sam. It's one of the things that fascinates me about how much knowledge you have in your head. Give you a couple of options to share one more story from your book, and then we'll switch into some of your favorite spots from around Wyoming. So here are a few options for you. One is a project that you could talk about. The other is this gentleman who doesn't have a
Elmer.
big story, but it's an interesting story. Which of the two would you rather?
Let's go with Minidoka. I'll just mention Elmer built his own car, and it turned out to be the first car east of the Mississippi. He just heard that one had been invented in Germany, and he decided, I'm going to build one. So he built his own. There it was in Laramie, Wyoming. But the Minidoka Project is just so shocking of how this picture could have been different. There was a plan, once the Bureau of Reclamation was working to essentially water the West, they were coming up with new places to put dams in and get irrigation programs going all over the West. And of course, they're a federal program, so they pushed for things that were interstate a lot of the time. One of them was called the Minidoka Project, and parts of it were already constructed. The dam that made Jackson Lake into a much larger lake than it had been, I think 30% large, 40% larger. That was the very first part of the Minidoka Project. But they had a plan to basically hold up all of the Snake River leading down into Idaho. Well, this only helped Idaho farmers. So the people of Northwest Wyoming were livid. And the state, even in Cheyenne, they said, yeah, we're behind it. Sure, they were going to get some federal funding with it and so forth. But the people of Jackson were like, no, you can't just do that. And an interesting thing with this was, one of the reasons they were opposed to it was that it was going to displace a whole bunch of homesteads. Now, what they were going to do was dam up, make one giant reservoir out of Jenny Lake, Lee Lake, and String Lake, if you know those lakes in Jackson Hole, which are under the Grand Teton, under Mount Owen and Tewanat and Mount Moran. They were going to make it into one big reservoir, and that was going to put a number of homesteads underwater. That's the other thing we don't think about is Grand Teton National Park, what we now think of as Grand Teton National Park, was made up of homesteads at that time. So the people of Jackson Hole were opposed to this, and they fought it. And in the process of fighting over it, they brought it up to the federal government, and the federal government was saying, maybe we should just be protecting the whole thing. Like, not just turn it into a reservoir, but turn it into something else. That then brought in, kind of quietly, the Rockefeller family, who the mountains themselves had already been deemed somewhat protected area. But he went about then purchasing up all these homesteads around the valley, not in his name, because then the price would have gone up, and then turned it into Grand Teton National Park, turned it over to the feds in the 40s, and there it was. But none of this might have happened. It very easily could have just turned into a big agricultural reservoir rather than a national park. And this Minidoka Project was the attempt to do that.
So the next time we find ourselves driving through that area, we could imagine that all of it was underwater.
Yeah, basically the western side of Grand Teton National Park being underwater right up to the mountains, which you could still have a nice park there, I guess. But all of those hiking trails, all of the things that we do that there's cabins, there's places to stay there, there's all sorts of resources. The access to climbing these mountains is all right from what would have been underwater.
And the way the story comes out in the book didn't to me feel like your typical history book, like you used the word dry in one of our conversations. It didn't feel dry at all. No pun intended, talking about things being underwater. I'll also mention for anyone who's watching that when you and I had an offline conversation about this image, what you did, Sam, was you said, I don't really know a lot about this story. And then you talked for at least 10 minutes and maybe 15 minutes about it. And that's another thing that I really find fascinating about the book is that there's so much depth in it. And again, not like any history book that I had ever read. And we haven't even gotten into so many details of the book. And not to be a hawk for the book, but it's pretty remarkable that I found a history book fascinating. So very well done.
I did my job.
Absolutely, at least with me. The other thing that I'd truly be remiss if I didn't ask you about, I don't know how many people in Wyoming actively rock climb. I'm guessing it's a small fraction of the population. So many of us think we know what it's like, but we don't get to see the images. We don't get to talk to people who do it on a regular basis. I thought it might be interesting to pull some of your experiences from your lifelong passion. This was one that you had sent me. Could you tell us a little bit about what we see here?
This is a friend of mine. He's since passed away, but this made the cover of the guidebook that Falcon printed to Wyoming. The rock climb is in Sinks Canyon, and you know, it's 10 minutes from my front door. And the rock he's climbing on there is Bighorn Dolomite, which is named for the Bighorn Range and is common all over the northern part of the state, and is it's an interesting rock to climb on because it's one of the few types of rock we have in the United States where you actually climb on solution pockets in the rock. There are edges and there are cracks, but there are more of these solution pockets than anything else. And the interesting thing about climbing on solution pockets is you can isolate fingers. So it's not just left hand, left foot, right foot. It can actually be which fingers are you using to hold on. That's one of the things that makes Wyoming rock climbing fairly unique in the United States. There's not a lot of this kind of pocket climbing, we call it, but there is in Wyoming.
And then in this image, a different
Same
person
rock.
with you practicing your photography skills.
Yeah, same rock. This is my wife, Liz, and this is south of Lander at the area we call Wild Iris, up by South Pass. And obviously in the fall, the climbing area there we call the Aspen Glade for obvious reasons, and it is spectacular. It's an absolutely beautiful place, and it's right, you know, after this picture's taken, the next morning I was out there, I was actually hunting elk in the same place. So this is something else that a lot of places don't get around the world. Wyoming is still connected to its rustic roots. We still go hunting in the same place that we go and play something like this. So our climbing area is actually a hunting area too.
The breadth of the resources is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
And these are two different shots.
Yes. So on the left, that's my wife and a woman in Jackson named Nancy Johnstone. They own the Alpine House over there, a bed and breakfast. And that's actually at the Jackson Hole Mountain Resort. And then on the right is this big wall climb we put up in the Wind Rivers a few years ago. And that's my friend Mike Lilligren is holding the rope at the bottom. We call that the belaying of it. And the person who's climbing is a friend who lives here, Alex, this was a very difficult pitch of climbing, and Alex Bridgewater is a very good climber. Some of the best climbers in the country actually live here in Lander. And Mike and I maybe were a little long in the tooth to pull this pitch of climbing off. So we said, Alex, we got to take you in there. Come on. And I took pictures, Mike belayed, and this crux pitch, he managed to do it pretty quickly. So, yeah. Worst base from about 12,000 feet.
I was just going to ask, what type of height we're looking at in this? Because you're looking down, but it's difficult to have perspective.
Yeah, there's no trees or anything down there. So if you drop something from right where Alex and I are at, it's going to fall a quarter mile before it stops. Because the wall's a little overhanging too. So it's not going to bounce off the wall lower down. And yeah, it's an impressive wall. It's a big wall.
And at the beginning of talking about that particular photo, you mentioned that you were laying a trail or laying a line.
Yeah, that's one of the fun things about climbing is it's a little bit like exploring a lot of the time. You don't know exactly, you know, especially on these bigger climbs, you don't know where you're going to go. The mountain has to kind of dictate it, and your skills dictate it along with the mountain. So there could be a much harder thing than you can do, and you're forced to go on an easier line, and you've got to pick your way through it. And the whole way up, you're finding out new things about that mountain. And so that's one of the fun parts of climbing is that exploration side. And this was a first ascent that we did. We do a lot of first ascents, and that's something also that's great about Wyoming is it is still wild, and we can still go out and be the explorers. Oh, that's a while ago. Yeah, that's me with hair. Yeah, Blacktail Butte in Jackson. Um, you can see it was actually taken with film back in the day when that crazy stuff was used. Snake River, Tetons, the potential Minidoka Project lake back over there, but is not in there. And I think this picture was probably 1990, something like that. I had hair.
When we go to say see a Mission Impossible movie with Tom Cruise and we see him climbing like this, what we don't see is all the safety lines that they green screen and CGI out. Uh, it looks as though you're out there largely by yourself in terms of safety equipment. There's some there, but you're also pretty exposed in these situations.
Well, I'm doing what you call lead climbing here, and it's on what we would call a sport climb, which means there is some protection fixed in place, and I go up as a climber, and it's a renewable resource. Any climber can come back and use that protection. So I'm clipping into that, but you can see there's a rope running down. It's just beyond my right foot there, and there's a piece of protection at my knee. Let's say I didn't have that piece clipped, and only this piece was clipped down here under my foot. Okay. Well, there's someone holding the rope at the bottom, and so the distance I will fall is the distance to that piece of protection, and then double it, because I don't fall and stop there. I have all the rope out, so I fall the full distance plus some stretch in the rope and things like that. The system is designed to catch you. It is designed to save you. Most problems that happen with it are user error. It's overbuilt. It's very strong, but you can't screw it up. That's for sure. And you've got to trust that your partner is there to assist you.
For those of us who've dabbled here and there, we go out to the University of Vitavu for an afternoon hike, and we end up on some rocks that we didn't really expect to end up in a certain situation. There are these moments where the survival instinct starts to kick in. You start to feel a little bit of fear in these situations. Does that still happen to you, or is it all old hat to you?
Every time. Yeah. But part of climbing is controlling that. So you're going to get the adrenaline rush. And some things give you a much bigger adrenaline rush than others. You know, you go to do a big wall climb isolated in the Wind River Range. You kind of have an adrenaline rush going on the whole time you're in there, because you know how isolated you are. You're on something like this, the adrenaline rush is going to last 15 minutes or whatever it takes for you to get up the wall. But you've got to control that. If the adrenaline just takes off, you get what we call sewing machine leg. You start to shake, and you can't do that. You've got to control it, or you're going to fall off the wall. And you know, in this type of climbing, you'll generally be okay when you fall off because your partner will catch you. But the instincts that we have, that you have, that make you scared, are what keep you safe. It keeps you focused. So don't get mad at that. Just try and control it when you're out there.
Well, two pieces of thanks. One, I'd never heard the phrase sewing machine legs, so I appreciate you giving me that. Yeah. Two, I just assumed that was a part of rock climbing because I always get in situations where I'm over my head, so to speak. One of the questions that leads us to kind of a wrap up in this conversation for today, Sam, is one of the folks who was watching sent a question in that asked about what you find most challenging about climbing and about being an author.
The first move. In climbing, you've got to get all set up. You've got to get all your equipment ready and everything. And then you take a deep breath and you go, and I'm talking when you're doing something that's a challenging climb, and you got to focus. And you've got to say, all right, I'm not going to get sewing machine leg, and I'm not going to start thinking about what I'm cooking for dinner tonight, or whatever it is that could take your mind elsewhere. You got to focus. And that starts right at the beginning. Now, the hardest part of the climb may be further up, but if you can't get your mind into it right there at the start, you're not going to make it further up. You've just got to focus. And writing a book, everybody you talk to says, I'd like to write a book, but I haven't. The hardest sentence to write is the first one. Always, always the hardest. Because you're not exactly sure where to start. And I guess it takes a while. There are writers out there. You know, Mozart was famous for this, that he would write a symphony and he would just sit down and it would be in his head and he would write it from start to finish. And interestingly, my understanding is that Tom Clancy was that way. Tom Clancy would sit down with an old typewriter and a telephone, and he would call and ask questions. And eventually he had a staff that he would call in to ask to look things up and so forth. But he just sat down and wrote those very complex books where it starts with 10 stories and it comes to 4 stories and it comes to 2 stories and it ends with one thing at the end. He'd write it from the very beginning to the end. I can't do that. I have to tell myself, you're going to write the first sentence and then you're going to probably not even have that as the first sentence, but just get it down, because once you start conversely putting it down, and as I said earlier, I write how I speak. Once you start that conversation with whoever it is you're talking to, it's going to just flow. And then you can come back later and fix it. But you've got to accept you're going to fix it, and that first sentence isn't going to be it. So I'd have to say starting out is the thing that is difficult with both.
And in both of the photos that folks see on their screen right now, you look awfully happy. It doesn't look like hard work. It doesn't look exhausting. I'm sure there's a grind to it. But you've now both done climbing long enough and authored enough books that I'm sure you're going to continue rolling in both directions. Do you have an idea yet for your next book?
I think I'm going to do some more historical stuff about Wyoming. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to unfold. But I've really enjoyed the research on Wyoming, and I've enjoyed the characters and the people that I've gotten to write about. And yeah, I think there's a few spots that I can go with that. And with the climbing, right now COVID's got us kind of canceled on some things. My wife and I and some friends were going to go over and climb Mount Kenya this year, which is a technical climb. It's not a hike up like Kilimanjaro is. But we're in the process of canceling out of that. That's not going to happen. I don't know what the next big climbing adventure is going to be, but I'm certain I'm going to be climbing in my backyard. And I'll have that same look on my face there, I guess, where you're tired, but you know, the things that you work hard for are the things that you're proud of. So
Totally worth it. Absolutely. So a couple of comments I would throw your way as we wrap up, and to those folks who end up viewing this. The book is not only available through mass media, but it's also something that either is or will be available at local bookstores. So if you happen to be a local bookstore fan as opposed to a mass market fan, if you can't find the book in the store, be sure to ask for it and they can get in touch with Sam and acquire the book. I know you've got great relationships with different booksellers, Sam, around the state. When Sam does tours, when that's something we're safe to do again, I can't recommend it enough, because anything you throw at him, you're going to get a story, and you're probably going to get 3 or 4 stories that are linked together, and they're all fascinating. So I can't imagine how much fun a book signing with you might be, just the different stories from different people asking about you. So I'm really looking forward to those events coming back.
I'm looking forward to that too. That was my plan for this spring, was I was going to be on a book tour, going to all the different bookstores, but you know, most of them have had to close down. They may be opening up now. I know that, you know, that in Laramie, Sheridan, Cody, Jackson, and Lander and Riverton, right off the top of my head, and I believe also in Casper, the book is in stock in some bookstores. But you know, some of the other stores that they just haven't been able to open up yet. So, but when they do, we should support our local bookstores, because local bookstores do a better job of supporting the diversity in writers. And you know, Amazon's a great thing. I love the fact that I have Amazon. I use Amazon a lot, but we in Wyoming should try and support ourselves here a little bit, I think. So yeah, buying it from somebody here is the best way.
Absolutely. And Sam, I look forward to the next book, more stories. What we'll do also is we'll post online connections where people can follow you, because I'm sure this is just the tip of the iceberg as far as more stories yet to come. A hearty endorsement for the book. And thanks for doing this today, Sam. Really appreciate it.
I've had fun being here, and anytime, man, anytime.
Everybody out there, thanks for joining us. Hope you have a great day out there.